In Bristol Township, the 5600 block of Truman Street is a residential stretch where nights usually pass quietly. On July 27, 2016, that street became the scene of a crime that would take nearly a decade to resolve fully. Shortly after midnight, gunfire broke the stillness, and by the time police arrived, a birthday celebration had ended in death. The man who was killed was Herbert Lyles. He was 38 years old, and it was his birthday. The gathering that night was not unusual. Family and friends had come together to mark another year of life. It was informal, familiar, and private, the kind of event where people assume they are safe simply because of who they are with and where they are. Birthdays create that atmosphere naturally. They invite closeness. They encourage people to relax. For Herbert Lyles, that sense of comfort would prove deceptive. At approximately 12:45 a.m., Lyles stepped outside the residence on Truman Street. Moments later, he was shot. The injuries were fatal. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. On the day meant to mark his birth, his life ended just beyond the doorway of a family celebration. Investigators would later determine that the shooting was not random. It was deliberate, and it was tied to a planned robbery. Earlier that same evening, around 9 p.m., Lyles had already been the victim of violence. Court testimony later established that he had been robbed at gunpoint hours before the fatal shooting. The robbery did not occur at the birthday gathering itself, but it raised immediate concern among his family. Lyles' mother, upon learning what had happened, urged him to leave the party and come home. She feared that the danger had not passed. Lyles chose to stay. That decision was not reckless. He was surrounded by people he trusted, in a familiar setting, on a night meant to celebrate him. The earlier robbery felt like a separate incident, finished, contained. But investigators would later conclude that it was not an isolated act. It was part of a broader targeting that continued into the early hours of his birthday. As the night moved toward midnight, the celebration continued without interruption. Guests talked, laughed, and moved in and out of the house. Nothing outwardly suggested that violence was imminent. There was no public confrontation, no visible tension. The earlier robbery remained in the background, overshadowed by the rhythm of the gathering. Shortly before the shooting, Lyles began receiving phone calls. Prosecutors later established that the calls came from John Marquis Wilson, a childhood friend of Lyles. Phone records showed that Wilson contacted him repeatedly in the moments leading up to the shooting. The calls were not incidental. According to court findings, Wilson used them to lure Lyles outside. There was no dramatic exchange, no raised voices, just a familiar name on a phone and a reason to step away briefly from the group. Lyles went outside. At 12:45 a.m. on July 27, 2016, gunfire erupted. The sound cut through the quiet street and instantly transformed the scene. The birthday gathering ended in confusion and panic. Police secured the area. Investigators began documenting evidence. A celebration became a crime scene. From the beginning, authorities believed the motive was robbery. Investigators confirmed that the suspects targeted Lyles because they had heard rumors that he was carrying a large amount of cash. Whether those rumors were true did not matter. The belief itself was enough to make him a target. The earlier gunpoint robbery supported that conclusion. Investigators later tied the events together, determining that Lyles had been singled out and pursued over the course of the same evening. The birthday gathering did not shield him from that attention. It made him accessible. Despite early investigative efforts, the case did not resolve quickly. No immediate arrests were made. Evidence existed, but not enough to bring charges. For Lyles' family, the loss was immediate. Accountability was not. The case went cold. That did not mean it was forgotten. Behind the scenes, detectives continued working. 2 grand jury investigations, one in 2018 and another in 2024, proved critical. These proceedings allowed prosecutors to re-examine evidence, compel testimony, and reassess the case using advances in technology that were not available in 2016. Extensive cell phone record analysis became the turning point. Investigators reconstructed movements, communication patterns, and proximity data tied to the hours before the shooting. Phone records placed John Marquis Wilson in repeated contact with Lyles immediately before the killing. Additional data connected George Javon Clark to the area and to the sequence of events surrounding the planned robbery. Together, the evidence formed a coherent narrative. Lyles was targeted because of rumors that he had cash, lured outside by someone he trusted, and shot during an attempted robbery. Arrests followed years after the crime. John Marquis Wilson pleaded guilty to third-degree murder. His plea acknowledged his role in drawing Lyles outside and participating in the events that led directly to his death. He was sentenced to 16 to 32 years in prison. George Javon Clark chose to go to trial. In November 2025, he was convicted of third-degree murder and sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison. The conviction marked the end of a legal process that had stretched nearly a decade from the night of the shooting to final sentencing. As we proceed to the next case, I'd really appreciate it if you could please take a moment to support my channel by liking this video and subscribing. Thanks for the support. Second case. Rachel Anderson turned 24 on Sunday, January 28, 2018. It was her birthday, but not one marked by ceremony or noise. At that stage of life, birthdays often arrive quietly, acknowledged, noted, then absorbed into responsibility. Rachel was living in Columbus, working at Shaw Davis Funeral Homes and continuing her studies in mortuary science. Friends and co-workers described her as dependable and focused, someone building a future shaped by care and professionalism. Nothing about that Sunday suggested danger. What followed did not begin with chaos. It began with an ordinary inconvenience. That evening, Rachel needed to retrieve a key. Trial testimony established that her apartment door could only be locked from the outside with a key, and earlier that day, her brother had accidentally taken her only copy. To resolve it, she left briefly to retrieve another key from Jonathan Kennedy, a friend who was the only other person in Columbus known to have a copy. The errand was meant to take minutes. During that short window, the apartment had to remain unlocked. During that window, Anthony Pardon entered the apartment. Pardon was a stranger to Rachel. There was no relationship, no prior interaction, no shared history. At the time of the murder, he was a registered Tier 3 sex offender, the highest risk classification under Ohio law. In hindsight, another detail would loom heavily over the case. One day before the murder, Pardon had been stopped by police for driving without a license. During that stop, officers found weapons in his possession. Because he was not linked to any new crime at the time, he was released. The system acted within its limits. Within 24 hours, Rachel Anderson would be dead. Prosecutors later argued, and evidence supported, that Pardon did not enter and immediately leave. He remained inside the apartment. He waited. When Rachel returned from retrieving the key, she walked back into her own home, unaware that someone was already there. What followed took place entirely within that space. Forensic evidence presented at trial showed that Rachel was restrained using cords taken from household appliances, preventing escape. Investigators testified that she was killed by strangulation using an electric blanket cord. A 9-inch steak knife was also used during the attack. That knife, however, was not recovered during the initial police search. 2 weeks later, after the apartment had been returned to the family, Rachel's mother discovered the knife hidden inside a box while going through her daughter's belongings. The delayed discovery showed how thoroughly the crime scene had been manipulated and how some details would surface only after the immediate investigation had ended. After the killing, Pardon concealed Rachel's body inside her bedroom closet. The following morning, Monday, January 29, 2018, Rachel did not arrive for her scheduled shift at Shaw Davis Funeral Homes. For co-workers who knew her as reliable, the absence was immediately concerning. Calls went unanswered. Messages were not returned. As concerns escalated, police were asked to conduct a welfare check. Inside the apartment, officers found Rachel's body concealed in the closet. The concealment mattered. It showed intent, an effort to delay discovery and distance the crime from the moment it occurred. Investigators immediately treated the case as a violent intrusion by an unknown offender. The investigation turned to reconstruction. Detectives focused on the narrow window of time when Rachel had left the apartment unlocked to retrieve the key. They examined who could have entered unnoticed and who remained afterward. Physical evidence and digital data guided the case. DNA recovered from the scene, including material collected through a sexual assault kit, was processed and entered into databases. At the same time, investigators analyzed electronic records. Cell phone geo-tracking data became central. That data placed Anthony Pardon at Rachel Anderson's apartment for approximately 90 minutes on the night of the murder. The duration mattered. It supported the prosecution's argument that this was not a brief intrusion or a chance encounter. It showed entry, waiting, commission of the crime, and remaining afterward. Surveillance footage then extended the timeline beyond the apartment. After the murder, Pardon did more than steal credit cards. He took Rachel's car and left the area. Surveillance cameras captured him with his sister and another individual, Anthony Sleet, using Rachel's debit cards at multiple ATMs. The footage showed coordinated movement, traveling together, making withdrawals, and spending money taken from someone already dead. Those images became some of the most unsettling evidence presented at trial, not because of violence, but because of how quickly Rachel's life was reduced to transactions. Those post-murder actions mattered legally. They demonstrated continuity, linking Pardon to Rachel's property, to her financial accounts, and to her vehicle in the hours after her death. They also reinforced the timeline established by cell phone location data. When Pardon was arrested, prosecutors presented a case built on convergence rather than conjecture. DNA evidence tied him directly to the assault. Cell phone data placed him inside the apartment for an extended period. Surveillance footage showed him using Rachel's cards and driving her car afterward. The later discovery of the knife further corroborated the nature of the attack described by forensic experts. The trial began in early 2020. Jurors heard testimony detailing how Pardon entered the unlocked apartment while Rachel was retrieving the key from Jonathan Kennedy, remained inside, and attacked her upon her return. Forensic experts explained restraint and ligature evidence. Investigators addressed the delayed discovery of the knife and how it fit within the established sequence of events. Digital specialists walked jurors through cell phone mapping and ATM footage. Each piece reinforced the others. In February 2020, the jury returned its verdict. Anthony Pardon was found guilty on multiple counts, including aggravated murder, rape, kidnapping, and burglary. The sentencing phase required jurors to weigh punishment against mitigation. The defense presented evidence describing Pardon's upbringing as abused, dysfunctional, and chaotic. Jurors acknowledged the severity of the crimes while considering that background. They rejected the death penalty. The final sentence was definitive. Pardon received 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 63 years for the remaining felonies and repeat violent offender specifications. The sentence ensured that he would never be released. Third case. Following his death, the YMCA League announced plans to honor Keon by creating memorial jerseys featuring his initials for the upcoming season. The gesture reflected how embedded he was in that community. He was not an occasional participant. He was part of the rhythm of that space. Keon Gil had just turned 44 years old. The birthday he had celebrated hours earlier was supposed to mark continuity, another year of life, responsibility, and presence. For his family, it was meant to be another reminder that he was still here, still active in his children's lives, still moving forward. Instead, the date became permanently tied to loss. In the early hours of Sunday, January 25, 2026, Keon Gil was in the Kingsbridge-Riverdale section of the Bronx, near West 242nd Street and Broadway. Earlier that night, he had been celebrating his birthday. There was nothing unusual about the evening. It was the kind of celebration that carries no sense of danger, time spent with familiar people, conversations stretching late, the calm expectation that the night would end quietly. Keon was not alone when he arrived in the Bronx. With him was his brother, Luis Gil. The two stood together on the street, in a space that felt ordinary and familiar. Apartment buildings lined the block. Cars passed. The neighborhood showed no outward signs of tension. There was no indication that either man expected trouble. According to police reports later shared through local media, a man approached them. Witnesses described the individual as wearing a black Nike tracksuit. What followed was brief and unfolded quickly. Investigators have described the encounter as a short confrontation, reported by some as an argument, by others as a physical struggle. Family members later said they believe the interaction may have been an attempted robbery, though authorities have not publicly confirmed a motive. The escalation was sudden. Within moments, shots were fired. The sound broke the quiet of the early morning, sending people nearby into instinctive flight. When the gunfire stopped, Keon Gil had been shot in the chest. His brother, Luis, had been hit in the knee. Emergency responders arrived and transported both men to St. Barnabas Hospital. Medical teams worked to treat their injuries, but Keon Gil did not survive. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Luis Gil survived his wound and later recovered. Police secured the area near West 242nd Street and Broadway as a crime scene. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood, searching for surveillance footage from nearby buildings and businesses. Witnesses were interviewed, and physical evidence was collected. The incident was classified as a double shooting, though only one victim lost his life. As of late January and early February 2026, police have confirmed that no arrests have been made. The investigation remains active. Authorities have not released additional suspect details beyond the clothing description provided by witnesses, and no official motive has been announced. For Keon's family, the lack of resolution has extended the trauma beyond the night itself. As the immediate shock faded, attention shifted to who Keon Gil was beyond the shooting. Keon was a father of 4. 3 of his children are currently in college, a point his family spoke about with pride. His ex-wife, Mahogany Gil, described him as a dedicated parent who put his kids first. Those closest to him emphasized that fatherhood was not something he performed occasionally. It was central to how he lived. He stayed involved. He stayed accountable. He stayed present. Friends and relatives consistently described Keon as dependable. He maintained routines, relationships, and responsibilities. He was someone people expected to see at family events, in community spaces, and in the places where he invested his time. One of those places was the YMCA of Middletown, where Keon was a regular player in the local basketball league. Known by the nickname Special K, he was a familiar presence on the court. Teammates described him as consistent and committed, someone who showed up week after week, not for attention, but because that was who he was. The decision by the YMCA League to honor him with memorial jerseys bearing his initials was not symbolic in the abstract. It reflected his real, repeated presence in that space. He was not a guest. He was part of the structure of that community. These details matter because they challenge assumptions about how violence enters people's lives. Nothing about Keon Gil's day-to-day existence suggested he was moving toward danger. His life was organized around family, work, and community involvement. The encounter that ended his life did not emerge from a long history of conflict or elaborate planning. It emerged from proximity. The confrontation that led to the shooting appears to have happened because 2 people occupied the same space at the same time. It escalated in seconds. There is no public evidence of extended preparation or a planned attack. The available information points instead to immediacy, access, opportunity, and rapid decision-making. As of when this video was uploaded, police confirmed that no arrests have been made and the motive remains under investigation, though family members believe it was a robbery attempt. As we advance to the next case, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you very much. 4th case. Football coaches shape lives long before trophies or headlines appear. They are the first adults many young players trust outside their families. They teach discipline, patience, teamwork, and belief, often on uneven pitches, after long work days, with no audience watching. In local communities, a coach is not a distant figure. He is present, consistent, remembered. Moses Miell was becoming that person. At 23, Moses was a trainee football coach, already spending hours guiding younger players, correcting small mistakes, encouraging confidence, and staying behind when sessions ended. Football was not just a pastime for him. It was a responsibility he took seriously. Those who trained with him spoke about his calm manner, his reliability, and how naturally he stepped into leadership. Coaching was the role he was growing into, one that anchored his days and pointed his future forward. Away from the pitch, Moses was also preparing for another responsibility. His girlfriend was pregnant. He was expecting to become a father. The idea of teaching, of being present, of guiding someone younger was no longer limited to football. It was expanding into his personal life. The future Moses talked about was practical and close, built on routine rather than fantasy. That future narrowed suddenly to a single date. October 12, 2018. It was Moses's 23rd birthday. The day began quietly. Birthdays often do. Messages arrived, conversations overlapped. There was time. Nothing about the morning separated it from any other milestone. Redbridge, East London, moved through the day without interruption. Streets filled and emptied. People returned home as usual. By evening, Moses was in Hainault, near Manfred Way, a residential road that rarely drew attention. Later reporting would emphasize how ordinary the setting was. No crowds, no special event, just familiar streets used daily by people who lived nearby. Nothing about the location suggested it would soon become the focus of police tape and candlelight. That night, violence entered without warning. Moses Miell was stabbed during an attack involving multiple assailants. Witnesses later told police that the attackers were wearing balaclavas, concealing their faces as they approached and fled. Another young man, aged 22, was also stabbed in the same incident. He survived. Moses did not. Emergency services were called. Police sealed off Manfred Way. Sirens replaced the background noise of the street. The birthday did not end. It simply stopped. Moses was pronounced dead from his injuries. The date remained October 12th, now carrying a meaning that could not be separated from what had happened. As the investigation unfolded, further details emerged. Detectives identified a stolen black Volkswagen Golf believed to be linked to the suspects. In the early hours of the following morning, at approximately 5:18 a.m., the vehicle was found burnt out in Parkview Gardens, a nearby residential area. The condition of the car suggested deliberate destruction, extending the timeline beyond the immediate scene of the attack. There were also critical absences. It was later confirmed that Redbridge Council's CCTV cameras on Manfred Way were not operating that night due to a technical fault. In a case where movement and timing mattered, the lack of footage shaped how events had to be reconstructed. Investigators relied instead on witness statements, forensic evidence, and what little remained after the suspects fled. Despite these limitations, police action followed quickly. Shortly after the murder, Ibrahim Mohammed, aged 19, was arrested and charged with the murder of Moses Miell and the attempted murder of the second victim. The charges marked a shift from shock to formal process. They did not bring relief, but they brought confirmation. As the legal process moved forward, the focus in Redbridge shifted to remembrance. Vigils formed along Manfred Way. Candles and flowers appeared, lining the pavement. People stood quietly, some knowing Moses personally, others drawn by the weight of the story. Notes mentioned football. Others mentioned his age. Many mentioned the date. As the case moves through the court system, we move to the fifth case. Umberto's Clam House sat on Mulberry Street in Manhattan's Little Italy, a neighborhood defined by familiarity. People knew the restaurants. They knew the waiters. They recognized the faces at nearby tables. Late-night meals spilled into early mornings there, especially on weekends, when conversation lingered longer than planned. In the early hours of April 7th, 1972, the restaurant was still full. Nothing about the room suggested it was about to become a crime scene. At one table sat Joe Gallo, celebrating his 43rd birthday. He was not surrounded by soldiers or enforcers alone. He was with family. His wife, Sina, sat beside him. Her 10-year-old daughter, Lisa, was there as well. His sister, Carmela, joined them at the table. Standing nearby was his longtime bodyguard, Peter Diopoulos, known as Pete the Greek, Diopoulos. Plates were on the table. The restaurant buzzed with the ordinary noise of a late hour, voices overlapping, dishes clinking, people unaware that timing was about to turn cruelly precise. Joe Gallo was born on April 7, 1929. Turning 43 was meant to mark endurance. His life had been shaped by conflict, prison sentences, power struggles, and public defiance. Surviving to that age was not guaranteed in his world, and the birthday itself carried meaning. It suggested continuation. It suggested that, at least for one night, survival had won. Gallo's place within New York's organized crime structure had never been stable. Closely tied to the Colombo crime family, he was known for challenging leadership and resisting hierarchy. He gathered followers who admired his refusal to submit quietly. For years, this made him a disruptive presence, sometimes tolerated, sometimes targeted, always watched. His imprisonment in the late 1960s temporarily removed him from the street, but it did not end the conflict around him. In June 1971, the balance shifted sharply. Colombo family boss Joe Colombo was shot at a public rally and left permanently incapacitated. The attack sent shockwaves through the family. Suspicion hardened. Blame circulated. Joe Gallo and those associated with him were widely believed to be connected to the tensions that led to the shooting. Whether that belief was accurate mattered less than the fact that it took hold. From that point forward, Gallo's survival depended on forces he no longer controlled. When he was released from prison later in 1971, Gallo did not retreat into the shadows. He moved openly through Manhattan. He spoke freely. He appeared in familiar places without disguise. To some observers, this looked reckless. To others, it looked intentional, a refusal to accept exile or invisibility. His birthday celebration at Umberto's Clam House reflected that same posture. It was public, familiar, and unhidden. Shortly after 4:30 a.m., the rhythm of the restaurant broke. Several armed men entered through a side door. Witnesses later described them consistently: short, dark-haired Italian men. There was no drawn-out confrontation, no warning shouted across the room. Gunfire erupted almost immediately. Multiple weapons were discharged. Ballistic evidence later showed that at least 3 and likely 4 firearms were used during the attack. Joe Gallo was struck multiple times at close range. Chairs overturned as diners reacted. People dropped to the floor. The room emptied in seconds. Despite his injuries, Gallo managed to move away from the table where his family sat. He staggered toward the front of the restaurant and made it outside onto Mulberry Street. Beneath the streetlights, he collapsed on the sidewalk. Emergency services were called, but the outcome was already fixed. Joe Gallo was pronounced dead shortly afterward, killed on the same date he was born. The shooting did not end with the attacker's first volley. As the gunman fled, Peter Diapolis drew a .25 caliber pistol and returned fire. His shots were defensive, aimed at the retreating men as they exited the restaurant. This exchange is crucial to understanding the scene. It confirms movement, multiple directions of fire, and a level of chaos inconsistent with any claim of a single stationary shooter. Forensic evidence reinforced this conclusion. Bullet trajectories showed fire moving from the side entrance toward the bar area. Shell casings indicated multiple guns. These physical details directly contradict later claims that the killing was carried out by one lone outsider positioned elsewhere in the room. Years later, dramatized portrayals would suggest that Frank Sheeran was the sole gunman. That version does not align with eyewitness testimony, ballistics, or expert analysis. Sheeran's physical appearance did not match witness descriptions. More importantly, organized crime historians have emphasized that this killing was deeply internal. It took place in the heart of Little Italy, in a neighborhood restaurant, on a date chosen for its meaning. Experts such as Jerry Capisi have repeatedly described Sheeran's later confession as embellishment rather than evidence. While Sheeran may have been connected to high-level figures, the consensus is clear. New York crime families did not outsource symbolic, high-stakes executions to outsiders. This was a message meant for insiders, delivered by people who belonged there. Although no one was ever convicted, most historians and informants point to a Colombo-connected team as responsible. Carmine Sonny Pinto DiBiase is frequently named as a primary shooter, accompanied by other associates. Officially, the case remains unsolved. Unofficially, its authorship is widely accepted within investigative and historical circles. Sixth case. On August 23, 2016, the promise of a happy birthday failed. Victoria Martins was supposed to turn 10 that day. 10 is a threshold year, one that usually arrives with excitement and a sense of growing up. Instead, August 23rd became a date that would never move forward for her. It would not be remembered for celebration, but for interruption. What makes birthday murders especially difficult to comprehend is not only the loss, but the distortion of meaning. A birthday belongs to one person more than any other day of the year. When violence intersects with that date, it fractures time itself, splitting expectation from reality. The moment of fracture did not arrive with noise. It arrived with an absence. In the early hours of August 23rd, inside an Albuquerque apartment, the normal rhythm of life failed to continue. Outside that space, nothing appeared unusual. The city slept. Phones stayed silent. Messages were not answered. There was no immediate signal to the outside world that a child's birthday would never be acknowledged. This is how collapse often begins, not with spectacle, but with delay. Victoria lived with her mother, Michelle Martins, and Michelle's boyfriend, Fabian Gonzalez. Another adult, Jessica Kelly, would later become part of the legal story. From the outside, this was an ordinary domestic setting, the kind that rarely draws attention. No alarms were raised. No neighbors reported disturbances that night. The absence of a visible warning is one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. When emergency responders were eventually called in the early morning hours, they found Victoria deceased inside the apartment. Investigators later confirmed that she had died on her 10th birthday. What followed was not immediate clarity, but confusion. Early statements provided to law enforcement did not align. Timelines shifted, accounts contradicted one another. The initial narrative, driven in part by a confession given by Michelle Martins, suggested a straightforward explanation. But as the investigation continued, that explanation began to break apart. This fracture in the case would become central to its legacy. Rather than resolving the story, the early confession complicated it. As forensic analysis expanded and digital evidence was reviewed, prosecutors discovered that key elements of the original account could not be true. Cell phone data and forensic findings revealed that Michelle Martins and Fabian Gonzalez were not present at the apartment at the exact moment Victoria was killed. In 2018, Bernalillo County District Attorney Raul Torres publicly acknowledged this contradiction. The confession that had initially shaped the case was false. The timeline it described did not match the evidence. The investigation had to be re-examined from the ground up. This revelation changed everything. It explained why the case moved slowly. It clarified why charges were revised. And it showed a difficult truth. Early narratives, especially in emotionally charged cases, can obscure reality rather than reveal it. As the legal process took place, responsibility did not disappear, but it became more complex. Fabian Gonzalez was initially charged with murder. However, DNA evidence introduced further uncertainty, including genetic material linked to an unidentified individual who was never charged. Because prosecutors could not prove who directly inflicted the fatal injuries, the murder charges against Gonzalez were dropped. In 2022, Gonzalez was sentenced to 37.5 years in prison after being convicted of reckless child abuse resulting in death and tampering with evidence. The sentence reflected his role in the events surrounding Victoria's death, even as the precise actions of every individual involved could not be fully established. Jessica Kelly's case followed a different path. She entered a no-contest plea to charges, including child abuse resulting in death. In 2021, she was sentenced to 44 years in prison, a term derived from an original 50-year sentence with 6 years suspended. Her conviction stood without the same evidentiary complications that altered other charges. Michelle Martins, Victoria's mother, ultimately pleaded no contest to intentional child abuse resulting in death. In 2019, she was sentenced to 12 years in prison. After serving approximately 9 years, she was released on October 14, 2025. These outcomes illustrate one of the most difficult realities of the case. The justice system resolved accountability within legal limits, not emotional ones. Sentences were served. Time passed. But August 23, 2016 remained unchanged. 7th case. Public health data reinforces this pattern. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention documents how community violence spreads through networks and locations, rather than remaining confined to specific individuals. Gatherings, whether parties, holidays, or celebrations, do not create violence, but they can magnify its impact when it intrudes. That reality sits at the center of what happened in Englewood, California, in the early hours of January 23, 2022. Inside a home on the 1300 block of North Park Avenue, Brenna Steins was celebrating her 20th birthday. Friends filled the house, music played, the night stretched past midnight the way birthdays often do. For Brenna, the meaning of the evening was simple. It was about being surrounded by people she cared about and marking the beginning of a new year of life. What followed had nothing to do with celebration. Shortly after midnight, gunfire erupted from outside the residence. Multiple shooters opened fire on the house in a sudden and overwhelming attack. Bullets tore through the structure. Panic spread instantly inside. People ran, hid, and tried to escape through any available exit. Brenna was struck by gunfire and later died from her injuries. Her sister, Marnisha Hamilton, was also killed. 2 other young men attending the gathering lost their lives as well. Several more people were wounded. Within hours, city and law enforcement officials made a critical clarification. This was not random violence. Authorities described the shooting as a targeted ambush. That language was used immediately to emphasize intent. The shooters did not arrive by chance. They came with a plan. The attack was deliberate and coordinated, not spontaneous or indiscriminate. At the same time, Investigators were careful to separate intent from outcome. As the investigation developed, the Englewood Police Department clarified that Brianna Steins was not the intended target. Detectives determined that the gunmen were attempting to kill a rival gang member who was present at the party and survived the shooting. Brianna, her sister, and the other victims were not personally targeted. They were killed because they were present when violence aimed at someone else entered the space. That distinction is essential to understanding the crime. The shooting was determined to be gang-related and part of a larger sequence of violence occurring across Los Angeles County that same night. Investigators later described the Englewood attack as one event within a broader killing rampage, tied to escalating gang conflict rather than to the birthday gathering itself. The house was selected because of who was believed to be inside, not because of what was being celebrated, yet the timing still mattered, just not in the way early speculation sometimes suggests. Birthdays do not motivate gang violence. There is no evidence that the date itself held symbolic meaning for the shooters. But birthdays change environments. They bring people together. They keep homes active late into the night. They increase the number of people present in a single location. In situations where targeted violence is already in motion, that concentration can turn a single intended act into mass harm. Criminal justice research supported by the National Institute of Justice shows that in gang-related shootings, victims are frequently not the intended targets. Instead, they are bystanders caught in the overlap between private life and organized conflict. When violence crosses into shared spaces, the consequences expand instantly. The original intent does not confine the outcome. Public health analysis reaches a similar conclusion. The CDC has consistently found that community violence moves through social proximity and physical locations, not just through individual disputes. When retaliation or rivalry reaches a gathering, everyone present becomes vulnerable. The gathering itself does not cause the violence, it amplifies its reach. The legal outcome of the case confirmed the scale of what investigators uncovered. In August 2025, Corey Irvin and Khalil Santos were sentenced to multiple life terms for the murders of Brianna Steins, Marnisha Hamilton, and 2 other young men. Prosecutors presented evidence linking the Englewood shooting to a coordinated series of attacks across Los Angeles County. The court determined that the violence was planned, mobile, and escalating. The birthday party was not an isolated target. It was one stop in a larger pattern of lethal intent. Those sentences closed the criminal case, but they did not close the story for the families involved. 8 case. Emergency calls reported a shooting on Kilburn High Road, outside the Woody Grill. Rain had gathered people beneath the takeaway's awning. It was a narrow strip of shelter meant only to keep strangers dry for a few minutes. Instead, it became the setting for extreme violence. At approximately 4:12 a.m. on Saturday, August 24, 2013, police and paramedics were dispatched to the scene. The street was quiet in the way early mornings often are, when night has not fully given way to day. The celebration that had begun hours earlier had crossed past midnight. It was no longer just the night before. It was her birthday. Among those standing beneath the awning was Sabrina Moss, celebrating her 24th birthday with friends. The gathering was unremarkable, people talking, waiting out the rain, passing time. Some of those nearby were known to her, others were not. The space was shared, temporary, and public. What followed was not confusion, it was deliberate. Court evidence later established that 2 firearms were discharged at point-blank range into the group beneath the awning. One was a MAC-10 submachine gun, fired 6 times by Hassan Hussein. The other was a shotgun, fired by Yasin James. The weapons were not brandished or waved. They were used decisively, in seconds, with overwhelming force. The attack was not random. The trial proved that the shooting was part of a deep-seated gang conflict between the Kensal Green Boys and the South Kilburn Gang. Members of the South Kilburn Gang were also sheltering under the awning, driven there by the rain. They were the intended targets. Sabrina Moss was not. She and her friend Sabrina Gachette were later confirmed in court as innocent bystanders with no connection to either gang. Gachette was struck by more than 50 shotgun pellets and survived after extensive medical treatment. Sabrina Moss was hit, collapsed at the scene, and sustained fatal injuries. The violence did not discriminate between targets and bystanders. It reached anyone close enough. Paramedics arrived quickly. Kilburn High Road was sealed off. Sabrina was transported to the hospital where she later died from her injuries. She was 24 years old. She died on her birthday. In the hours that followed, early media reports struggled to reconcile the facts. A nursery teacher celebrating her birthday had been killed in what was clearly a gang-related shooting. That contradiction was not the result of poor reporting. It reflected the reality of the crime. Sabrina Moss had no involvement in gang activity. She was a nursery teacher and the mother of a 4-year-old son. Her life, as described by family and confirmed in court, revolved around work, childcare, and planning for the future. She spent her days caring for young children. She was raising one of her own. None of that shielded her. The investigation that followed was extensive. Detectives reviewed CCTV footage, tracked movements before and after the shooting, and recovered forensic evidence linking the firearms to those involved. Over time, the structure of the attack became clear. It was not a spontaneous act. It involved multiple roles. Hassan Hussein and Yasin James were identified as the gunmen. Ballistics and witness testimony tied Hussein to the MAC-10 and James to the shotgun. The intensity of the weapons and the number of rounds fired became central to the prosecution's case. Martell Warren did not fire a weapon. Evidence established that he was the getaway driver, responsible for transporting the gunman to and from Kilburn High Road. During the trial, Warren claimed he believed he was driving the men to a drug deal, not a shooting. The jury rejected this explanation, concluding that his participation enabled the attack and its aftermath. A fourth man, Simon Baptiste, was also convicted. Baptiste acted as a spotter, identifying the presence of rival gang members and alerting others to their location beneath the awning. His role did not involve firing a weapon, but it facilitated the violence. He was convicted of conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm and sentenced to 4 years in prison. The distinctions between these roles mattered in court. They did not matter on the pavement outside the Woody Grill. In September 2014, Hussein, James, and Warren were each convicted of murder. All three received life sentences, with a minimum term of 37 years before they could be considered for parole. The sentencing reflected the court's assessment of planning, intent, and the reckless use of extreme firepower in a public place. Ninth case. Birthdays create expectation by design. They encourage people to relax, to assume continuity, to believe the night will close gently simply because it began with joy. That expectation did not survive past midnight. For Biba Henry, June 5, 2020, was meant to be a pause from everything else. She had turned 46. Friends gathered to mark the occasion in a way that felt modest and familiar. Music, conversation, shared food, and the quiet comfort of being surrounded by people who knew her well. It was not a dramatic celebration. It was the kind of birthday that carries an unspoken promise: nothing bad is supposed to happen tonight. The gathering took place at Friant Country Park in Wembley, North London, a public green space known to everyone present. As the evening moved toward early Saturday morning, people began to leave in small groups. There was no tension in the air, no argument, no visible sign that the night was heading anywhere other than home. The celebration thinned naturally, as birthdays usually do. Biba stayed behind with her younger sister, Nicole Smallman, who was 27 years old. The sisters were close, and witnesses later described them as relaxed, talking, listening to music, enjoying the quiet after most guests had gone. It was the final stretch of a birthday that had unfolded exactly as expected. At 1:05 a.m. on June 6th, Nicole sent a text message to her boyfriend, Adam Stone, saying they were dancing in a field. It was an ordinary message. It carried no urgency, no fear, no hesitation. It reflected the moment as it truly felt: safe, unremarkable, intact. There was nothing in that message that suggested it would soon become evidence rather than memory. That text would later stand as one of the last confirmed signs of life from either sister. Sometime after that, before 2:30 a.m., both Biba Henry and Nicole Smallman were attacked and murdered in the park. The exact moment remains unknown. What is known is that the violence occurred within hours of Biba's birthday celebration, in the same place where laughter had filled the air earlier that night. Mourning did not bring closure. It brought absence. When Biba and Nicole did not return home, concern escalated quickly. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages were not delivered. As time passed, worry hardened into fear. Attempts to report the sisters missing led to missing person logs being opened and then closed. The response was later described by oversight investigators as unacceptable. For the family, it felt like dismissal at the moment they needed help most. With no sustained police search underway, those closest to Biba and Nicole began looking themselves. On June 7, 2020, Adam Stone entered Friant Country Park to search for them. As he moved through the area, he found a pair of glasses in the grass. Nearby, he discovered a knife. Continuing forward, he came upon the bodies of Biba Henry and Nicole Smallman. The shift from expectation to reality happened all at once. The park itself had not changed, but its meaning had. The same ground that had hosted a birthday gathering less than 2 nights earlier was now sealed off with police tape. Forensic lights replaced music. The place where life had been marked became the place where death was confirmed. Investigators began reconstructing what had happened. There was no known connection between the victims and any suspect. No argument had been reported. No dispute had preceded the violence. The attack appeared sudden and unprovoked. The breakthrough did not come from witnesses recognizing someone on camera. It came from DNA. Forensic material recovered from the scene was entered into national databases. It did not produce a direct match. Instead, it revealed a familial DNA link, pointing investigators toward a close relative of the unknown suspect. That relative was the father of Daniel Hussein, an 18-year-old from the same borough. Once Hussein was identified through the familial DNA connection, detectives began examining his movements in the days leading up to the murders. That work led them to CCTV footage from an Asda supermarket in Collindale, recorded shortly before the killings. The footage showed Hussein purchasing a knife block. The CCTV did not stand alone. It corroborated the forensic evidence. Together, the DNA and the surveillance footage formed a clear chain: identification, preparation, and presence. Hussein was arrested and charged. During the investigation, detectives also recovered a handwritten document created months earlier. Prosecutors argued that it demonstrated planning and intent. The document described a belief that killing women as part of an occult ritual would lead to a Mega Millions lottery win, a specific financial outcome Hussein believed would follow the acts. The prosecution did not present this belief as a rational motive. It was presented as evidence of premeditation. At the Old Bailey, the trial unfolded without spectacle. Evidence was presented methodically. DNA established identity. CCTV confirmed preparation. Digital records supported the timeline. There was no claim of provocation, no relationship between the killer and the victims, and no escalation from conflict to violence. On July 6, 2021, Daniel Hussein was convicted of the murders of Biba Henry and Nicole Smallman. On October 28, 2021, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 35 years before parole eligibility. In sentencing, the judge emphasized the deliberate nature of the crimes and the irreversible harm caused to the victim's family and the wider public. But the case did not end with the conviction. What followed became one of the most disturbing chapters of the story, not because of the murders themselves, but because of what happened afterward. 2 Metropolitan Police officers, Denise Jaffer and Jamie Lewis, were later convicted of misconduct in public office. Court evidence showed that Jaffer photographed the sisters' bodies at the crime scene and that Lewis superimposed his own face onto one of those images before sharing it in a WhatsApp group. In December 2021, both officers were sentenced to 33 months in prison, 2 years and 9 months each. For the family, the misconduct was not a side issue. It was another violation layered onto an already unbearable loss. Biba and Nicole's mother, Mina Smallman, described the actions as a sacrilegious act, saying they deepened the harm done to her daughters. An independent Office for Police Conduct, IOPC, investigation later concluded that a call handler had provided unacceptable service during the initial missing person reports, leading to the premature closure of logs. While the IOPC did not determine motive, the family has consistently maintained that institutional racism influenced how their concerns were handled in the critical early hours. 10th case. Marjorie Morett's birthday became a date that could never move. For 79 years, it had marked life continuing forward, another candle, another quiet celebration, another reason for the family to gather. On Tuesday, July 2, 2024, that meaning stopped. From that day on, the calendar froze. What had always been a birthday became something else entirely, a fixed point of grief for her family, her colleagues, and a community that knew her not by headlines, but by presence. Marjorie Morett was a 79-year-old great-grandmother, widely described by those who loved her as selfless, gentle, and deeply committed to helping others. For more than 25 years, she volunteered at Lyell McEwen Hospital, becoming one of the people who quietly hold institutions together. Volunteers like Marjorie do not appear in job titles or management charts, yet their absence is immediately felt. They remember faces, offer directions, sit with nervous patients, and make unfamiliar spaces feel human. Her service was not casual or occasional, it was consistent. Over decades, she became part of the hospital's daily rhythm. That dedication did not go unnoticed. Marjorie was formally recognized for her service, receiving a Premier Certificate in acknowledgement of her outstanding contribution as a volunteer. To her family, it confirmed what they already knew. To the community, it put words to something that had long been felt. On the morning of July 2, 2024, Marjorie left her home in Elizabeth East and set out on the familiar walk to the hospital. Inside Lyell McEwen, her fellow volunteers were already waiting. They knew it was her birthday. A cake had been prepared, ready to be shared once she arrived. It was meant to be a small moment, a quiet recognition for someone who never sought attention. That detail would later become one of the most painful reminders of the day. She was expected. She was missed almost immediately. As Marjorie approached the roundabout at the intersection of Midway Road and Kincaid Road, she began to cross. At that same moment, a vehicle entered the roundabout. The collision that followed was sudden and devastating. Emergency services were called. Marjorie was rushed to Lyell McEwen Hospital, the very place she had been walking toward, the place where she had given so much of her life. Despite medical efforts, she died later that day from her injuries. The investigation that followed was careful and factual. Police treated the incident as a traffic collision, focusing on conditions at the scene and the actions of the driver. Court documents later revealed additional context that helped explain how the crash occurred without changing its outcome. The court acknowledged that significant glare from the morning sun affected visibility at the roundabout. This glare reduced the driver's ability to see clearly in the moments before the impact. Toxicology testing showed that the driver was not intoxicated, though traces of THC were detected in her system after the incident. These findings did not suggest impairment at the level associated with intoxication, but they formed part of the factual record considered by the court. The driver, Nadia Bellafemini, was charged with causing death by careless driving. In September 2025, she pleaded guilty. The court sentenced her to a suspended jail term of 2 months and 24 days and imposed a 15-month license disqualification. The legal outcome followed established procedures, measured, structured, and bound by law. But for Marjorie's family, no sentence could restore what had been taken or loosen the grip that one date would now hold. Please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.